We will go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here this morning. Thank you, Derek, for that. Before we get into the class, I want to bring something to your attention. Inserted in the bulletins is a postcard. This is a save the date for our gospel meeting that we have coming up at the end of May. I'd encourage you to make sure that you get one of these. You can do a few different things with it. You could either put it on your fridge as a reminder for yourself, or if you turn it over, it's got a place for a stamp and a place for an address. You could actually mail this to someone and invite them to come to the meeting as well. If you're someone you don't want to pay for stamps, let me know and I will personally pay for your postage if you want to send this to somebody, because I think it's important to get the word out there. So be aware of that. Those are inserted in your bulletin. There's a few extra ones on the back table as well. If maybe you have more than one person you want to mail it to, let me know. Yeah, I mailed those already, yep. We're going to continue in Matthew chapter 17. We started this last week. We looked at the first 8 verses, which tells the story of the transfiguration of Jesus. And so just by way of reminder, we saw that Jesus went up on this mountain and he took with him Peter and James and John. And they have this moment on the mountain where they see Jesus transfigured. To be transfigured simply means to have your appearance change. That's what the word literally means. The word in the Greek is, we get our word metamorphosis from that. And so that's a change in appearance is simply what that means. Jesus' face was shining, which is reminiscent of Moses on Mount Sinai. And also his clothes were bright white. And so that's how his appearance changed. And that's a significant part. But really the most significant part comes, and if you remember last week I had on the screen sort of the chiastic structure that we see in the first 8 verses. And in that chiastic structure, the center of this story is the voice from heaven. I believe that's in verse 5. A bright cloud overshadowed them. We pointed out that that's a bit of a paradox. Bright things don't usually overshadow things, but that's what happens here. And the voice says, "This is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." And you may recall that the reason that that is significant is because Moses and Elijah were also up there on the mountain, and they were having a conversation with Jesus. And Peter has the moment where he kind of, as he does, brazenly comes in and says, "Lord, it's good that we're here. If you want, I'll build a tent for you and a tent for Moses and a tent for Elijah," as if they're equal. But they're not equal. Jesus is greater than both of those. And in fact, Jesus sort of is the fulfillment, really, of both of those, thinking of them being the law on the part of Moses and the prophets on the part of Elijah. Jesus said previously in Matthew 5, he's not abolishing the law and the prophets, but he's come to fulfill them. So you can see Jesus in that light here. There's the voice from heaven. The disciples fall on their faces and they're terrified, and then they lift their eyes up and they see Jesus only. And so this is sort of a reminder, and really there's a lot going on here. They're seeing the glory of Jesus. Peter made that point in, I think it's in 2 Peter chapter 1, he makes that point, where they've seen the glory of Jesus and they heard the voice from the cloud and so on and so forth. And in 2 Peter, I think he calls this the Holy Mountain, which is another Sinai parallel. There's a lot of parallels between Sinai, and we looked at some of that last week. And so now we continue in Matthew chapter 17, and this is actually, I was going to get to this, but we didn't have time. And so we'll continue now in verses 9 through 13, where Jesus and James and John and Peter, they're coming down from the mountain, and they have this interaction one with each other. And it's kind of fascinating what they say to each other. So with that, let's read verses 9 through 13 of Matthew 17. It says, "As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them again being Peter and James and John, quote, 'Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead.' And the disciples asked him, 'Then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come?' He answered, 'Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands.' Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. And so we see in this the topic of the conversation. It is the resurrection. Jesus brings this up. You have the coming Elijah. The disciples bring this up. And then you have Jesus' shared fate with this coming Elijah, who, spoiler alert, had already come, as Jesus says. And so this interaction begins in verse 9 with Jesus telling them to not tell anyone what they saw. This is commonly called the messianic secret. It's something that Mark draws out more in his gospel account, but we certainly see it in Matthew. We certainly see it in the other gospel accounts as well. Don't tell anyone what you just saw. There's a secret to this. Jesus wants them to keep this hush-hush. And it makes you wonder why. And that's sort of the whole question about the messianic secret. Why keep it a secret? Because you might think, well, you want as many people to become disciples of Jesus as possible. You'd think the best way to do that would be to quickly spread around the things that he was doing. What most people conclude with that is if word spreads too quickly, they're going to kill him too quickly. There's a time when Jesus is going to be delivered. That time is coming and it's imminent and we're getting closer to it. But if word spreads too quickly, it might happen prematurely. And so perhaps that's part of it. That's the explanation that most people come up with in terms of why the messianic secret. There's something here in this occasion that's really interesting, though. Because Jesus says to not tell anyone what they saw, but he gives a time. Don't tell until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. He gives that clarification there, and I think that's significant. He doesn't just say, don't tell anyone. He says, don't tell anyone until the Son of Man, speaking of himself, is raised from the dead. And so that raises the question, why the secrecy? And why would it be okay to say so after he's raised from the dead? What is the significance behind this? It seems to me, and this is based on other things that Jesus has said throughout Matthew's gospel account, things that have come up, such as there's not going to be a sign given except the sign of Jonah, that the Son of Man will be in the earth 3 days and 3 nights, and he'll be raised, so on and so forth. It seems to me that perhaps the glory of the resurrected Christ is going to be greater than that of the transfigured Christ. As if Jesus is saying, I know you've just beheld my glory on the mountain, and I know my face was shining, and I know my clothes were bright white. But there's going to be a better glory that's coming that you'll see. That glory you can share with other people. That glory will be the greatest testimony that you could give, the fact that Jesus will be raised from the dead. And so that's, in this particular occasion, that's what it seems like is going on to me. The glory of the resurrected Christ will be greater than that of the transfigured Christ. As glorious as Jesus would have been when he was transfigured. So he tells them to keep this a secret. And the resurrection gets brought up because Jesus brings it up. And with that topic, the 3 disciples, Peter and James and John, they ask a follow-up question. And it's somewhat related in terms of their expectations of the resurrection with what Jesus has said. And it pertains to the Elijah who was to come. This is the Elijah that's prophesied about in Malachi chapter 4. And so, once again, the disciples ask, then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? They had this expectation that before the day of the Lord comes, that this Elijah was going to come. And the reason they had that expectation is because that's what Malachi 4 verses 5 and 6 says. The day of the Lord is coming, Elijah's going to come first, is what that says. I guess I could read that. Malachi is just the book before Matthew, if you turn a few pages back. These are some of, in fact, they are the closing words of the Old Testament, where it says, Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. Now, by awesome, that doesn't mean awesome like it's used today, where that just means something is good. Awesome in this sense is something that gives you awe. That's what the day of the Lord will be like. He'll turn, this is verse 6, he'll turn the hearts of fathers to their children, the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. So we see in Malachi's prophecy that this Elijah is coming before the day of the Lord. What is the day of the Lord? Depending on where you're reading, it might mean different things in different contexts. In Malachi's context, I think it's safe to assume that it's the end. The day that the Lord will come and will destroy this earth, and so on and so forth. You could say it's the day Jesus would return. That seems to be the same occasion, although people will say differently. So this question pertains to the Elijah who is coming. And this has eschatological implications. By eschatological, that means end-time implications. In other words, if Elijah doesn't come, then the day of the Lord isn't coming. If you don't have Elijah, you don't have the Christ that will be coming. And so the day of the Lord is sort of that's not the right word. It's sort of dependent on this Elijah person coming. And so Jesus says, don't tell anyone until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. They say, well, what about Elijah? Elijah's supposed to come. And so Jesus gives them an answer, and in his answer in verses 11 and following, he actually affirms what the scribes have been saying. The scribes are correct, because that is what Malachi chapter 4 says, that Elijah is coming before the day of the Lord comes. They're going off of this prophecy, and they're right. And one thing that's interesting, and a lot of people get hung up on this, but I think it's more simple than it seems. Because included in this prophecy, Jesus mentions this, is the restoration of all things. Well, what in the world does Jesus mean when he says, I'll read it again in Matthew 17 and verse 11, Elijah does come and he will restore all things. Well, what in the world does that mean? Well, this is again the prophecy of Malachi 4. Behold, I'll send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. He'll turn the hearts of fathers to their children, hearts of children to their fathers, so on and so forth. That in verse 6 of Malachi 4 seems to be the restoration, quote unquote, that Jesus is referring to. Fathers being restored to children, children being restored to their father. That has eschatological connotations behind it in the Jewish frame of mind. And you can see a parallel to this in Luke's gospel account in Luke 1, when speaking of John the Baptizer, because spoiler alert, John is the Elijah. It says, he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. He will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. That's what is said of John the Baptizer in Luke chapter 1. And so, when you look at this, what is the restoration of what is coming? Or what is the restoration of all things? Seems like John was going to do that, but they killed him before he had the chance. That's what it seems like to me. And just as they killed John, they're going to kill Jesus too. I'm getting ahead of myself. And so Jesus says, he will come, he will restore all things. Not only will he come, but he has come. Jesus says that in verse 12. I tell you, Elijah has already come. And so this Elijah that they've been waiting for, because there are certain messianic implications in this. They're waiting for this Elijah just as they're awaiting the prophet like Moses, which was alluded to from Deuteronomy, I think it's Deuteronomy 18. That was alluded to from the voice from the cloud saying, listen to him. Just as they had been waiting for that prophet like Moses, they've been waiting for this Elijah figure to come as well. Well, not only is he coming, but he's already come. And Jesus has already identified the Elijah to come as John the Baptizer. We saw that in Matthew chapter 11. And as Jesus says here, he was here, he's come. But they, and by they he means the Jewish leaders, they didn't recognize him. And we read the story previously, I think it's in Matthew 14, or no, is it 14 or 15? I think it's 14, of when John is killed. And there's that whole story with Herod and so on and so forth. And so as Jesus says here, not only did they not recognize John as Elijah, but they did whatever they wanted to him. And they had him arrested. We read that in Matthew 4 and verse 12. And they killed him. It is Matthew 14. And what we see is there is some foreshadowing going on here. We've talked about already about how John the Baptizer is a forerunner for Jesus. He comes to prepare the way for Jesus. That's part of John's job. That was prophesied about. I think it's in Isaiah's prophecy that is mentioned. John certainly did that, but he's a forerunner for Christ in more ways than one. Not only does he prepare the way in terms of their ministries and in terms of their preaching and so on and so forth, but he also prepares the way in terms of their fate. Because just as they did to John, so also will they do to Jesus. Jesus makes the case for this in verse 12 when he says, they did to him whatever they pleased, so also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Jesus makes the case here, the same ones that were behind killing John, they're the same ones that are going to be behind his killing. It's the Jewish leaders as a whole. It's different leaders. Herod is separate from the ones who are going to orchestrate Jesus' killing. That's by and large the high priests and so on and so forth. But it's still the Jewish leaders who are orchestrating this. And just as they killed John, they're going to kill Jesus as well. And that is the climax of this gospel account that we are inching our way towards. We've seen foreshadowings take place. We continue to see that. And eventually Jesus is going to begin to make his way to Jerusalem. That's the next destination. And it's in Jerusalem is where these things are going to happen. He told them that in Matthew 16. He's going to have to go to Jerusalem. He's going to have to suffer these great things. He's going to be killed. But he will be raised from the dead. And so just as they had done to John, they will also do this to Jesus. And so in more ways than one, John continues to be a forerunner for Christ even after John has been killed. Because just as they did to John, they'll do to Jesus. And of course, we see the disciples understood that he's speaking of John the Baptist. And so there's some things going on here, and this is, keep in mind, fresh off of the vision of the mountain. The transfiguration, they've seen Moses and Elijah, so on and so forth. Jesus' glory has been seen. Jesus is showing them, despite the glory you've just seen, I'm going to be killed. Just as they did to John, they're going to do to me. We come to the next story now, which is a story where Jesus heals a boy who is oppressed by a demon. And so this is Matthew 17, verses 14 through 21. I'm going to get to you at the end, CJ. I got a lot of material. I'll give you a chance, don't worry. Unless we get out, unless I'm done at like 10:46 or something. In that case, I'm going to have to put a suppressor on you. All right, Matthew 17, starting in verse 14. When they came to the crowd, a man came up to him, and kneeling before him, said, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has seizures and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him. And Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him. And the boy was healed instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, Why could we not cast it out? He said to them, Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, Move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. This is a really fascinating story, especially when you compare it to some of the other accounts of this. In other accounts of this, I know Mark references it. I don't know if any of the other ones reference it. In Mark's account of this, specifically, the point of this story is to show Jesus' authority to do this. But that's not necessarily Matthew's point. Matthew's point here is highlighting the short-sightedness, again, of the disciples. That's sort of the main takeaway from this, is the disciples' inability to cast out this demon. We do see that Jesus' authority is put on display, because he's able to do what the disciples couldn't do. But we see again, on display here is a lack of faith on the part of the disciples. They asked Jesus privately, why couldn't we have done this? And he specifically tells them, it's because of your lack of faith. It's not that they didn't have the ability to do it. They had a lack of faith to do it. That is what Matthew highlights for us here. So let's look at this. We see that this boy is having these seizures. He's epileptic, as some versions might say. Some of your versions, I think, might even say, if you have like a King James, for example, or maybe a New American Standard, what's the word it uses? He's a lunatic. I think might be what the New American Standard says. The word here particularly means that they have convulsing kinds of seizures. So I think epileptic or seizure is an appropriate way to put it. Lunatic is maybe an older way to put it, because you think of lunatic now and you think of a crazy person. But he's someone who's having these epileptic seizures. And so it's interesting, on the surface, this seems like it's a physical thing, because we know epilepsy is a condition today. We know people probably who suffer from it. I know I do. People who suffer from epilepsy, they have a tendency to have seizures and so on, and so they might have to take medication to keep that under control. And I'm not totally sure if it's a chemical imbalance or what it is that causes that, but it is a physical sort of condition that you have. And so to our eyes, we think of this as a physical condition, but we see later that this boy is demon-possessed. We know that because Jesus cast the demon out. You can't cast something out that's not there. So this boy is demon-possessed. There's a common question that gets asked in relations to this story. Is this two particular issues that the boy is having? Is he epileptic and demon-possessed? Or is the epilepsy a symptom of the demon possession? Bert Kaufman, he's a brother in Christ, and he has commentaries on the Bible, and he believes that this is two different issues. He believes that's part of why the disciples had a hard time with this, because it's not one issue but two. I don't agree with that. I think it's evident when you look at this that the epilepsy is brought on by the demon, because we see in other places that demons, when you're possessed by a demon, as it is portrayed in the Bible, not what people portray today as demon possession, but when you're possessed by a demon as it appears in the Scriptures, they have capabilities to control you physically as well as among other things. So it's my opinion that this is epilepsy that's brought on by the demon possession. I could be wrong, but that makes the most sense to me. And so this boy is epileptic. He's having seizures. And the seizures are resulting in the boy harming himself. He falls into fire. He falls into water. This is obviously a pretty significant thing that's going on. And you can understand why this boy's father is imploring the Lord to fix this. Because what father would want to see his son in that state? Obviously, no good father would. And so he would fall into fire and water. And we see that this is really destructive behavior. And this is pretty typical when it comes to demons. Demons are destructive by nature. And so they are physically destroying this boy in this sense. So there's this story that's going on, and Jesus is able to rebuke the demon, and the demon comes out. But the significance of this story, as Matthew is recording it, and again, Matthew has a reason as to why he's framing this in this way, because Matthew has a particular agenda that he's wanting to draw out. He has a particular story that he's telling, in contrast to the way Mark might be telling it, or how Luke might be telling it, or so on. Matthew is his own independent writer. He has his own independent agenda here. The real crux of the issue here is the fact that the disciples tried to cast out this demon, and they failed. They want to heal the boy, but they are unable to do that. And again, it's not the reason why they can't do it. It's not because they don't have the ability. You and I, we don't have the ability to cast out demons. We just don't. That ability isn't given to us. But it was given to them. We saw this in Matthew chapter 10. This is what is commonly called the limited commission, as opposed to the Great Commission, which will come at the end, where they go into all the world. But in Matthew 10, this is where Jesus sends his disciples into the Judean area there, to Jews, and he gives them authority, among other things, to cast out demons. And so Jesus has given the disciples the ability to do this. So they have the ability, and yet they're still not able to do it. That tells us that that's a problem with themselves. It's not a problem with their ability to do it. Not only has Jesus given them the ability to do it, but he's even shown them how to do it himself. They've seen Jesus do this numerous times. So they have the ability to do it. They know how to do it. But the issue, as Jesus is going to say, is their lack of faith. Their lack of faith is the reason why, that they are unable to do this. So again, why couldn't they heal this boy? In verse 17, Jesus says, "O faithless and twisted generation." He's addressing his disciples here. "Faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you?" So he calls them faithless in verse 17. Then in verse 20, when they're meeting with Jesus privately and they ask, why couldn't we do this? Jesus tells them, because of your little faith. And then he gives them this really strong statement of faith in verse 20. If you have faith like the grain of a mustard seed, then you can do all these great things. You can move mountains and so on and so forth. And so what Jesus is saying here is you don't need a lot of faith to do this. The faith the size of a mustard seed, which was pretty small, even that much faith can do as much as move mountains. So it just takes a little bit of faith to do the mightiest of things. That really is vindictive on the disciples. It doesn't take much faith to do these great things, and yet they don't even have that much faith. There's a really big contrast that's being drawn here. The amount of faith you could have to move mountains, as he mentions in verse 20, versus the faith that they are lacking to not even be able to cast out this demon. That they know that they can do because Jesus has given them the authority to do that, and that they've seen Jesus do numerous times. So they know it is capable of being done. They knew that they had the capability of doing it, and yet they don't have the faith to do it. One other thing on this section that I'll point out, some of your versions might have a verse 21. Mine does not. There's a little footnote in mine where verse 21 would be. That's a difference of manuscripts. There's big conspiracies about how if you have something besides the King James, these other versions are taking verses out, and it's a big conspiracy. They're wanting things not in the Bible. That has nothing to do with it. It's a difference in manuscripts. The King James uses a particular manuscript. Others, like the ESV, which I read from, uses a different set of manuscripts. It's just a difference in manuscripts. Some verses are included in one, they're not included in others. And so that's the difference. Verse 21, if you have it, in my footnote, it says some manuscripts insert verse 21, but this kind never comes out except by prayer and fasting. So, and that's something that I think is included in Mark's account, and that's part of Mark's agenda, but it doesn't seem to fit with what Matthew's talking about, so perhaps that's why they don't think it belongs there. When it comes to looking at the manuscripts, you have to think, okay, what's more likely? Is it more likely that someone would have taken this out, or is it more likely that someone would have inserted this in? The translators of the ESV and others, they seem to think it's more likely that someone would insert that in instead of taking it out. So that's why they don't include it, but they do have a footnote of it. If you have any questions about that, let me know, because I could go in more detail about it at another time, but for the sake of our time this morning, I'll move on. I've talked about that before, but it is kind of a complicated issue. So now we come to verses 22 and 23, and here Jesus once again foretells of his death and his resurrection. This is just really short. I'll go ahead and read it. As they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." And they were greatly distressed. So once again, Jesus foretells of what's going to happen to him. There's been hints of it. There's been foreshadowings of it. Jesus has outright said it at least one other occasion, back to chapter 16, and now he says it again here in chapter 17. He's going to be delivered. We know that Judas is going to deliver him over. He's going to be killed. But he's going to be raised on the third day. One thing that's interesting, I guess I just kind of said it, but I touched on this before because when Jesus is transfigured, I pointed out that that's a passive verb in the original language, which means it's not something that Jesus himself is doing. It's something that's being done to him. And so we see that here once again. Be delivered is passive, meaning it's something that's done to Jesus, not done by Jesus, necessarily. It's the difference between saying, I delivered this, versus saying, I was delivered. Do you kind of understand that? If it's passive, it's being done to the person. And so, who is it that is doing the delivering? There's different things you could say. On the one hand, Judas certainly has a hand in it. He's the one who is delivering Jesus over. He's the one who betrays Jesus in the garden. On the other hand, you could say God is the one who's going to deliver Jesus, because this is part of God's plan of salvation, that He is going to send Jesus to the cross to be that sacrifice for our sins. God certainly has a part in this. But then again, does Jesus also have a part in this? Some of our New Testament writers, in particular, I think all of those are from Paul's writings. In particular, Paul's writings highlight the fact that Jesus did give Himself. And so you could look at passages such as in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 4. I should have marked that. Galatians 1 and verse 4, where it says, I'll start in verse 3 actually. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ, who gave Himself for our sins. So here we see it's Jesus who's given Himself. That's what Paul says in Galatians 1 and verse 4. You could go also to Galatians 2 and verse 20, where it says there, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me. You see, once again, it's Jesus who has given Himself. Another place you could go is to 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 6, where it says here, I'll start in verse 5, for there is one God and there's one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus, who, speaking of Christ Jesus, who gave Himself as a ransom for all. Once again, Jesus has given Himself. And then you go to Titus chapter 2 and verse 14, which says, it's talking about Jesus, who gave Himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for Himself a people for His own possession who are zealous for good works. So you see numerous times it's referenced that Jesus has given Himself. So you see kind of an interesting thing going on here. Well, who is it that's doing the delivering? Is it Judas? Is it God the Father? Is it Jesus Himself? Is it all of the above? I think you could certainly say that.
John 3:16.
That's right, yeah. God so loved the world that He gave.
God gave His only begotten Son.
Right. So that's just an interesting tidbit there. And so Jesus tells them again, He's going to be delivered, He's going to be killed, He's going to be raised on the third day. And the disciples are greatly distressed at this. This is an emphatic statement. They're not just distressed, they're greatly distressed at this. And so this is an interesting thing that we see here on the part of the disciples because of the fact that they are distressed about this. Now, it's obviously bad news to hear that Jesus is going to have to go and suffer these things. They're close with Jesus. You could say that they love Jesus and they care about Jesus, and so you don't want someone that you love and care about to have to suffer. That's understandable. But Jesus says that He'll be raised on the third day. And so it is unfortunate that Jesus has to suffer these things, but it has a happy ending. And so you would think maybe they would react a little differently, but we see that they're greatly distressed. This shows us either one of two things. Either one, they have a lack of faith in Jesus being truthful, that He is going to raise from the dead. Either they don't believe Jesus. My Monday meditation that I'm going to post for tomorrow kind of says some things about this, what you do when you believe someone or not. If they believed Him, I don't think they would be greatly distressed. So it is either that, or perhaps they have a lack of understanding about what it means to be raised from the dead. And you could certainly see in the fact that maybe they don't understand just how glorious Christ will be when He is raised from the dead, and the fact that He will go and reign in His kingdom, and so on and so forth. So their distress, either way, it's not good on the part of the disciples. And this coincides with what we've already seen, and we've seen in the last several chapters, about some short-sightedness, especially going back to chapter 16, in particular on the part of Peter. But we see that they had a lack of faith to be able to cast out that demon. And now, once again, we see either they have a lack of faith in Jesus telling the truth about him being raised from the dead, or they have a lack of knowledge. Either way, it's a short-sighted thing on the part of the disciples, which has been a thing we've seen throughout these most recent chapters. That will be culminated when Jesus is turned over and they're going to scatter like sheep, which is, again, something that is prophesied about. But I digress. We'll get to that at the appropriate time. Now we come to another section here in Matthew 17, and we see that they were gathering in Galilee, and now they come to Capernaum. And there's an interesting story here where Peter is asked about taxes. It's tax season. Taxes are on a lot of our minds right now, so we got to get those ready to turn in and so on and so forth. So let's read this, verses 24 through 27. This is through the end of the chapter. And let's see what happens here. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And he said, "From others." Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself." And so they're in Capernaum now, and Peter is asked a question about his teacher, which isn't very typical. Usually you ask teachers about their students, but here they ask the student about their teacher. And the question is about the 2 drachma tax. Do any of your versions, if you're reading along, say something different besides 2 drachma? I should have looked at that ahead of time, but I didn't. 2 days' wages? 4 drachma? Well, it'd be 4 if both of them pay. Maybe that's what they're saying. Or else maybe they have a different unit of measurement for what that is.
24 is the 2 drachma tax, and then 27 for Peter and Jesus is 4 drachma.
Yeah, because Peter's going to find that shekel. The shekel is worth 4 drachma. And so that's enough for 2 people's taxes. So it'd pay for Jesus and for Peter. Can I just say, it's kind of, I don't know the word, it's just interesting to think that Jesus doesn't have to pay taxes, but he's willing to do it. That's so counterproductive from what we think today. If you don't have to pay a tax, you get out of it every which way you can. Any loophole you can find, you take it, so on and so forth. Jesus isn't obligated to do it, yet to not offend them, he is willing to pay it. I think that is very interesting. So the question is about the 2 drachma tax, also known probably as the temple tax. This is something, and it depends on if you can concretely say what particular tax it is. There are some taxes in the Old Testament that this is probably alluding to. I don't remember off the top of my head where they're mentioned. I know it's in Exodus somewhere, where there's taxes that are mentioned to be given. But this is a tax that was taken, and so they aren't taking taxes for Rome. They're taking taxes to go toward the temple in some way, shape, or form. And so it's interesting. They asked Peter, does your master pay taxes? Is he going to pay the 2 drachma tax? What is their motive in asking this? Are they just curious? Are they asking from a greed point of view? In other words, hey, your master better pay up. Or perhaps is this entrapment? Maybe they want Peter to say, no, he's not going to pay taxes. Then they could get him on some sort of trumped-up charges or something. So it's an interesting thing to ask, does your master pay the tax? Perhaps it was an optional task. That's something that's floated out there as well. Maybe it's something that wasn't necessary to pay. Maybe it was optional. Maybe it was something not like a tithe where it's required of you, but maybe under the Old Testament, because we don't tithe anymore. But maybe it's something like our contribution today, where you give as you've prospered and so on and so forth, and you give cheerfully, not begrudgingly, so on and so forth. Maybe it's something along those lines. I'm not totally sure. So they asked Peter, does your master pay the temple tax? He says, yes. Then he goes back to where Jesus is, and Jesus kind of takes Peter to task about it. And it's kind of an interesting interaction. Jesus raises a question. Do the kings of the earth tax their sons? Specifically, I'll read the way he phrases it. What do you think, Simon? Notice he calls him Simon and not Peter. That's kind of like when your mom calls you by your full name. Kind of, maybe I'm reading into the tone, but it kind of seems like that. What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? In other words, if you are a king, does the king expect his son to pay taxes? Probably not. He's going to let his son get out of that. Probably. That's the case that Jesus makes. Does he expect it from his son, or does he expect it from other people? He expects it from other people. And Jesus takes that and applies it to himself, thinking about being a temple tax. Who is the beneficiary of that tax? Who is it supposed to go toward? It goes to God, right? This is for God's work in the temple, so on and so forth. Well, thinking along those lines, if God is the one taking the tax, Jesus as his son, is he obligated to pay it? According to Jesus, no. Jesus is making a point here about his sonship. Keep in mind, Peter's already told him in Matthew 16, you're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God. Peter's already said that Jesus is God's son. Whether he totally knew what that meant or not, that could be discussed. But we see here that Jesus is not under any obligation to pay this temple tax. And yet he does so anyway. Not to offend them, he will pay. This says something, I think, about sometimes we like to be offensive for the sake of being offensive, and I don't know if that's totally appropriate. Jesus certainly he had every right to not pay the tax, but so as to not offend them, he pays it. Now, maybe you could say there's some messianic secret stuff going on. Maybe they would have killed him a little quicker if he didn't do that. I don't know. I think sometimes we are offensive for offensive's sake, and I don't think that's right. And so to not offend the tax collectors, Jesus is going to pay the tax. And he sends Peter on a fishing trip, which, keep in mind, Peter's a fisherman by trade, so kind of a cool thing that Peter gets to do. And this is really an odd miracle that Jesus performs here. He sends Peter to go catch this fish, and the mouth of the fish is going to be this coin, this shekel. A shekel is enough to pay for 2 people's taxes. It would be equivalent to 4 drachma, going on their measurement. And he's able to pay for his taxes, and he pays for Peter's taxes. If any of you want to pay my taxes for me, I'll gladly let you. I don't expect that, though. Jesus pays not just for his taxes, but also for Peter's, for this temple tax. And so what we see happening here, Jesus, he draws attention to his sonship, and then he proves it with another miracle. Now, this is kind of an odd miracle. It's a little different from some of the other ones. And it's a cool one, I think. And Peter, as a fisherman, I think would have appreciated this more, perhaps, than some of the other ones. Because I'm sure he's pulled up fish and he's looked in their mouths and so on. And I don't know if he's ever found a shekel in a fish's mouth until now, when he goes and he does it. So let's wrap up this chapter. What are some threads we see in Matthew 17? We'll go all the way back to verse 1, looking at the transfiguration, and then some of the things we've seen in the rest of this chapter. One thing we obviously see, you see this most notably in the transfiguration, but you see it in some of these other things. You see the glory and the authority of Jesus. It is highlighted throughout this chapter. You can see it in the transfiguration. They were able to behold his glory. They saw his face. They heard the voice from the cloud, right? As Peter talks about in 2 Peter 1. And so they beheld his glory at the transfiguration. It was testified by the voice from the cloud. This is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. That highlights his glory as God's Son and his authority. You need to listen to him. As opposed to Moses and Elijah. And we've seen his authority and glory in these various miracles he's performed. He heals the boy with the demon, and then he does this thing with the fish and the shekel. So that's one thread you see. You see the glory and the authority of Jesus highlighted. That's obviously a pretty prominent theme in any gospel account, especially in Matthew's. Another thing we see is we see the coming, and I have it so that it fits on the screen, gospel, the coming death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That's what the gospel is by definition, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. And so we see the coming, you could say the coming passion, the suffering that Jesus is going to endure. He tells them when they're coming down from the mountain, don't tell about what you've seen. Don't tell about this vision until after the resurrection. Jesus is already bringing attention to it. Don't say anything until after. We see that just as Elijah had suffered, just as they did what they wanted to Elijah, so also will the Son of Man suffer. And then finally, Jesus foretells it again in verses 22 and 23. The Son of Man is going to be delivered, he's going to be killed, but he will be raised from the dead. And so we see throughout this chapter, Jesus' death and his resurrection are highlighted multiple times. And that's going to continue to be the case leading up to it when we get to the end of Matthew's gospel account. And then finally, we see the still short-sightedness of the disciples. We've seen it throughout the gospel account in various places. It's intensified a little bit starting in chapter 16. You see it when Peter rebukes Jesus. You see it in their lack of understanding about what it really means to be the Christ and the Son of the living God. And you see it here in this chapter. Peter seems, perhaps you could say he's overstepping on the mountain when he says, I'm going to make a tent. Or he asks Jesus, I can make a tent for you and for Moses and for Elijah. As if to equate Jesus with Moses and Elijah. He's not their equal. He is greater than them. We see it also in the fact that he is unable, or the disciples are unable to cast out the demons, or the demon in this case. And we see it also in the fact that they're greatly distressed when Jesus talks about his coming death and resurrection. So we still see the short-sightedness on the part of the disciples. I don't think we have time. Thanks.